thank you very much for joining. My name is Leo Hickman and I edit the website Carbon Brief. And welcome to our first ever webinar. We are really thrilled that so many of you have around the world actually have registered to watch. At the last count, we've got about 2,500 people, which is just simply incredible. Today's topic for discussion is extremely topical and has been a big global talking point for several weeks now. It's this question, which is, with so many countries in lockdown due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and with so many sectors of the economy curtailed as a result, we are discussing what impact this is having on global emissions today. And we have the perfect panel here today. Everyone you can see on the screen alongside me has recently published their own analysis on this very issue, including actually Carbon Brief's very own Dr. Simon Evans, our policy editor. So wave, Simon, so everyone can see you.
Sorry, Leo, just to interject, colleagues are saying, Carbon Brief colleagues are saying that they're getting messages saying that the meeting is at max capacity of 100 participants. So I'm not sure if something's gone wrong there.
Ah, okay. Well, Simon, if you carry on, maybe if you can begin with Corinne and ask about Corinne's research, I'll go off and have a quick look at the settings.
Sure, yeah. So just this week, a paper was published in Nature Climate Change, and we're joined today by the lead author of that research, Corinne Quéré, who's a professor at the University of East Anglia and former director of the Tyndall Centre on Climate Change. Your research, Corinne, was the first peer-reviewed study to look at how global carbon emissions have been affected by the crisis. And you found that at the sort of peak of the pandemic in early April, emissions were cut by 17%. It'd be great if you could tell us a little more about what you did and how you came to that conclusion.
Thank you, Simon. Yeah, so just a little background that this research originated because starting the end of February and going into March, I started to be bombarded by questions from journalists asking how much the emissions were decreasing, if they were decreasing at all. And I was so embarrassed that I wasn't able to provide an answer that I decided actually, yes, let's go for it. But the problem is we don't actually have energy statistics. Typically, you take energy use in coal, oil, gas, and you convert that to emissions to know how the emissions are going to be to CO2. And you don't have that for all the countries around the world on a daily basis. So what we did is, if I could have the first slide, Leo, what we did is we looked at what data we do have, and there we were really helped by tech company who put a lot of data on the web freely available during the pandemic. And we looked at data that indicated how much activity changed for sectors of the economy. Thank you. And each of the points that you see on that graph here represents a time series. We looked at almost 700 time series of activity around these sectors. And we looked at different levels of confinement, how much in percent-wise, how much each sector decreased its activity. And if you look at the green dots, for example, that's all the indicators, 4 different indicators of transport. And it showed overall about a 50% drop in transport during maximum lockdown confinement. And then we developed you can stop the slide, thank you. And then we developed a lockdown indicator for all countries around the world every day of the year. And we did essentially a big bookkeeping method to come up to the change in emissions by country over different levels of lockdown. And as you said, we arrived to this 17% change in global emissions at peak lockdown. The biggest contributor in our analysis was changes in surface transport, mainly from people staying at home. Each individual country had a bigger drop in emissions. In total lockdown, we had countries with a drop in emissions from 31, 32%, like the UK and the US, 34% in France, and even New Zealand over 40% because of the contribution of aviation there. But because the peak in drop down was different in different days, then it added up to 17%. So in the discussion today, I'll go maybe a bit more into this, but just to say for now that this drop in emission is temporary because it's not a structural drop. It will do nothing to slow down climate change, but it's really what we do now in response to the COVID crisis to get out of this crisis that will change, in fact, everything. Thank you.
So thanks, Corinne. I just want to say that we're obviously experiencing problems with the number of attendees that are allowed in. It's very bizarre, and I can't work out what the issue is at the moment. I'm just contacting Zoom. We should have capacity for 3,000 people, but they only see, and we've paid for that, but we only seem to be allowed in 100 at the moment. So, and I've just checked the license, and it said it's fine. So it seems to be a technical issue at Zoom's side, but I'm going to urgently try and sort that out. Just to say that we are live streaming this on YouTube at the moment via the Carbon Brief YouTube channel. And you should be able to get the address for that either via just typing in Carbon Brief on YouTube and or going to our Twitter account where we've posted details. So extreme apologies for this while we just try and sort this technical issue out. But I'm actively trying to contact Zoom right now, although it looks like it is an issue at their end. Thank you, Corinne. Let's maybe move on to Richard now. I'm just going to sort out Richard's slide, but Richard, you published some analysis on Carbon Brief recently, actually, with some Met Office colleagues and some Scripps Institution of Oceanography in the US colleagues, looking at the concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere and what impact this lockdown might have had on that. I'll just bring up your slide now while you begin to explain that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so this is some work that's been happening in parallel with Corinne's paper, but it does tie in quite nicely, and I think it's broadly consistent. But I think we probably will want to update it with the more thorough analysis that Corinne and the team have done. But yeah, what we're showing, well, what we do, the Met Office routinely every year publishes a prediction of what the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration is going to do in the coming year. So it's important to distinguish between the concentration, the amount in the atmosphere, and the emissions, which is the amount we're putting into the atmosphere. They're not the same thing. Because the concentration is also affected by how much is taken out of the atmosphere by natural sinks on land and in the oceans. I don't know if you're not on full screen there, Leo.
Oh, yep, sorry.
Thank you. It's a fairly simple approach that we use. We use the information on emissions. We also use information on what's happening in the climate, because it is known that the carbon cycle depends not only on emissions, but also what's happening in these carbon sinks, which depend on year-to-year changes in the climate, particularly things like El Nino. So the speed in which CO2 builds up in the atmosphere depends not only on the emissions, but also how much is taken out by the sinks. So in an El Nino year, for example, you tend to get weaker sinks in tropical ecosystems because the climate is warmer and drier. So you get a faster rise in CO2 for that year. So the emissions from human activity, from burning fossil fuels and deforestation, are driving the year-by-year buildup, but the speed of that gets faster and slower depending on the strength of the sinks. And it's actually that bit that we focus on in our regular forecasts, because that's the bit which changes more usually. Normally, the year-by-year change in emissions is not large enough to have a substantial effect on the predicted emissions for the coming year. So in January this year, we did our routine forecast, and we predicted that the average CO2 concentration in the atmosphere measured at Mauna Loa in Hawaii, which is the site of the longest running data set, longest running record of CO2. It started in 1958 by David Keeling. It's now run by Ralph Keeling, his son, and their team there. It's a continuous record, and we focused on that. And our prediction was that the annual average CO2 concentration at Mauna Loa would have been 2.8 parts per million higher on average this year than last year. So to put that in context, that's slightly more than the average rise over recent years. Normally it rises by around about 2.5 parts per million every year. Goes up and down a bit. It was faster when we had the large El Nino event in 2015, but normally it's around about 2.5 parts per million. We predicted 2.8 this year because of mild, warmer conditions in the Pacific Ocean earlier in the year, at the end of last year. But it soon became clear that with the emissions cuts that were happening, that may be large enough to impact on the buildup of CO2 in the atmosphere this year. So we thought we should redo our forecast, taking account of that. And actually, we did this about 3 times because the data kept changing. Because our initial go, which we made in about March, was just with a very sort of simplistic estimate of a global emissions cut. There was a few estimates coming out earlier on, and we plugged that in and made one estimate. But then more detailed data came in, and we started to develop methods to actually improve the forecast month by month. And then at the end of April, Carbon Brief published an article with the analysis from the International Energy Agency, which at that time, obviously, we didn't have access to Corinne's work. So at that time, that was the most detailed data that we could find. So we turned that into an input to our own method. We used an atmospheric transport model, so a model which simulates the wind flow around the Earth, and we used that to simulate the effect of this emissions reductions on the CO2 concentration and its drop at Mauna Loa compared to what was otherwise predicted. Subtracted that from our original forecast and came up with our revised forecast, which was 2.48 parts per million of a rise in CO2 compared to the original 2.8. So a slightly smaller rise, but still a rise. And that's the important thing, really, that even though the emissions cuts are quite large, they're not large enough to have substantially impacted on the buildup of CO2 in the atmosphere. We're still putting more in there, perhaps slightly slower. And the analogy we've been using for this is filling a bath with a tap. If you want to put that graphic up, Leo, the next slide. So if you imagine that the CO2 emissions are the tap running into the bath, and the CO2 in the atmosphere is the water level in the bath, what we've done is slightly turn down the tap, so the water or the CO2 is flowing less, but it's still building up. So the water level in the bath is still rising. The CO2 level in the concentration in the atmosphere is still rising, but just not as fast as it was before. So to really stop the buildup in CO2 in the atmosphere, we actually need to turn the tap right down and ultimately turn it right off.
Thank you, Richard. I'm just going to ask Simon to move on to Lauri and ask Lauri about his research, just while I quickly try and continue my Zoom headache and try and get everyone else onto this call. But if Simon, you can just introduce Lauri's research first, and then we can hear from that. Thank you.
Yeah, so we've got Lauri. Sorry, Lauri, I won't attempt to pronounce your surname, but you can maybe educate us. Lauri's the lead analyst at the Centre for Research on Energy and Clean Air, and we've recently published 2 bits of analysis that Lauri did. One of those with a colleague at Quéré. The first was in mid-February, and it was really, I think, the first kind of serious attempt to quantify the CO2 impact of the coronavirus crisis. Obviously, that being felt most strongly in China initially, and Lauri looked at a bunch of data coming out of China to work out that emissions had fallen by a quarter. And subsequently published similar sort of analysis looking at how things have played out in India, and it'd be great to hear from Lauri about how you've done those analysis, what sort of data you've looked at.
Thank you. Like we've been, as Simon said, we've been tracking the impacts since late January, early February, when it became clear that this is an unprecedented crisis in China. We've looked up, we've used a lot of daily and weekly data sets that are available that we've been working with already before for quite a while. That was important for our work as well, because we're not new to these data sets, but we've looked at how they can be used to predict monthly and yearly data that comes out later. So in China, there are data sets available tracking daily coal consumption in power plants, weekly operating rates of steel plants, coking plants, port throughput, oil refinery throughput, and so on. And all of these give us a handle on what's happening in the economy and with emissions on a very granular level. Overall, I'll just say that my interest in this comes from not from the immediate impact that a crisis like this might have over 1 or 2 months, but from the understanding and the knowledge that economic crises have profound impacts on the long-term emissions trajectories of countries. Not just because of policy responses, but also because of economic changes and impacts. If you think about the oil crisis, the collapse of the Soviet Union, global financial crises, and so on, all of those have had very profound impacts on different countries and often in different directions. So looking first at China, going into this crisis, the country had another construction boom of a few years engineered by the government after a domestic slowdown in 2014, 2015. Steel consumption had been growing faster than the reported GDP, which is quite remarkable, showing how construction was driving the economy. That was starting to slow down last year, and then the crisis came. We estimate that in February, March, there was a 25% reduction in emissions. But after that, the emissions and the heavy industry sectors have rebounded very fast, especially in early May. And a big part of that is expectation of another construction boom, another wave of construction projects to stimulate the economy. So industries like steel have been producing way ahead of demand, expecting government stimulus to soak up their production going forward. Right now, there is a huge debate among Chinese policymakers about what the economic response to this crisis should be. There are strong voices saying that the kind of old school stimulus program is not the appropriate response right now because of the debt and the overcapacity, the overhang from previous such rounds, and because right now the big economic challenges are in cities. Fresh university graduates, they're not going to get jobs from these kinds of programs. So they push back against this kind of a round of stimulus is much more from the financial side of things than from the environmental side. In fact, climate is conspicuously absent in this debate. The very important signal will come tomorrow with the start of the National People's Congress and the work report of the Premier, where the GDP target or lack thereof for the year will be announced, and that will determine how much debt-fueled construction will be needed to hit such a target. Or there could be a signal that just hitting a GDP number at whatever cost won't be the focus this year, but the focus will be in supporting consumers, creating jobs, and pursuing the kind of high quality growth that China has been talking about for years. I'm at my 5 minutes, but I'll say a couple of things about India. We highlighted already in October last year that India's emissions growth was slowing down. We said that India was headed for the smallest increase in CO2 emissions in decades because of a combination of an economic slowdown and a rapid increase in renewable energy in recent years. And then the impact from COVID came on top of that in March, leading to a reduction of about 15% in India's emissions in March. And then we estimate about 30% in April. The policy response initially was quite promising. There was quite a lot of talk about supporting renewable energy and using that as part of the economic strategy to get out of this crisis. Recently, there was a power sector bailout that channeled a lot of money to the sector, but unfortunately failed to address the chronic issues with overbuilding of coal power and overall lack of financial viability for the sector. Let's talk more in the discussion, but I'll just recap by saying that I think it's clear that this crisis will have massive impacts on policies, economic policies, energy policies pursued by these countries and others, and it will have massive structural implications for the trajectories that these countries are moving along. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks, Lauri. So next up we have Zeke, and Zeke, you're over in San Francisco at the moment, and so we appreciate you getting up at this very early hour for yourself. And you've been looking at this issue as well, obviously, and you've got a sort of you've done. I've seen you've put out some tweets and analysis this week, in fact, looking at whether, or raising this question around whether this might actually be, we might actually be seeing a peak in global emissions, which is an interesting question. But do you just want to sort of dive in and explain some of your own findings on this?
Sure. So broadly, there's two different ways to try to assess the impacts of COVID-19 on 2020 and later CO2 emissions. The first is sort of a bottom-up data-driven approach, as the Lauri's work did, as the recent Nature Climate Change paper that Corinne and authors put together, and as Simon did for the Great Carbon Brief article last month on the subject. But the other way to look at the question is more of a top-down approach to say, okay, given the forecast changes in economic activity, more broadly of GDP, for example, what can that tell us about likely changes in CO2 emissions, given the historic relationship between countries' CO2, global CO2, and their economic activity. And so if you put up the slide that I had sent over.
Sorry, so I'll just bring that up.
So there's been a number of different estimates of the sort of CO2 impact of COVID-19 over the last 2 months. You know, obviously most of these were not peer-reviewed estimates, in part because peer review is a challenging process when things move this quickly. But at the same time, it's an essential part, as we see with this new paper. But the first estimate we found of COVID-19 impacts on global CO2 emissions came from Glenn Peters, who's also a participant in the Global Carbon Project. And this was very early on in mid-March, where he estimated that there's likely to be about a 1.2% decrease in 2020 emissions with a wide uncertainty. At the time, there wasn't much data about infections outside of China. There was a huge amount of uncertainty of how big a global crisis this would be. And obviously, he gave some very large caveats to that. A few weeks later, myself and my colleague Steve Wayne came out with an analysis based on some very early JP Morgan estimates of effects on economic activity. This was March 26th, where we estimated about a 2.2% decline in emissions was the most likely outcome, with a range of 0.5 to 4. Michael Liebrich, who's the founder of Bloomberg New Energy Finance, around the same day came out with a rather prescient, albeit slightly hand-wavy estimate of a 5% reduction. Rob Jackson, also at the Global Carbon Project, gave a rough estimate of 5% as well around the same time in an estimate with Reuters. Carbon Brief came out with an article, which was sort of the first global, more bottom-up energy consumption estimate-driven approach, where they estimated 4% initially. There was a University of Paris estimate that was extremely wide, from 3 to 14%. Carbon Brief then updated their estimate to 5.5%. Glenn Peters came out with a new estimate using more of a GDP approach that was about 5.7%, ranging from 4 to 7. I came out with an updated version after that looked at 2 different GDP scenarios based on a new IMF report. One where the global economy recovered fairly quickly and we only had a 3% decline in emissions, 3% decline in GDP in 2020, and one where it recovered much more slowly and there's about a 5.8% decline in GDP in 2020. And that led to about a 5% and 7.5% reduction in emissions respectively, with a fairly wide range. The IEA came out with their estimate around the same time, again, using that higher end GDP scenario of a 5.8% reduction. They found an 8% reduction in emissions. And then obviously the new Global Carbon Project paper in Nature Climate Change. What is quite interesting to me actually is that the results between these more top-down GDP-based estimates and these bottom-up energy use estimates are remarkably consistent. In sort of the low scenario where the global economy recovers relatively quickly, there's only about a 3% decline in global emissions in 2020. We get consistent values of around 4 to 5% best estimate, with a quite similar range actually. And similarly in the case where the global economy takes a lot longer to recover, there's about a 5.8% reduction in GDP in 2020. We both get around 7 to 8% reduction in emissions, again with a wide range. And so the fact that you get the same results with very different approaches is encouraging. Obviously, there's still huge uncertainties in this, and both in terms of how economies recover, in terms of if there's a second wave or not, and in terms of what happens afterwards. But that's sort of a quick rundown of all the different approaches that have been used so far. And there's another paper that's making its way through peer review that has a preprint released that tries to do a similar type of real-time assessment. Now, a number of the previous speakers have talked about this, but one of the big challenges with this type of event is determining what it means going forward. Obviously, we need to have global emission reductions of around 7 to 8% every year going forward if we want to meet 1.5C targets. And clearly, we can't lock down twice as hard next year and 3 times as hard the year after that. This sort of approach to emissions reduction is not sustainable or desirable given the manifest human suffering that accompanies it. And so it really highlights the fact that we need to use this as an opportunity for more systematic change in the way that we generate energy and the way that we change our behaviors to have a lasting impact from this. And there is a real concern that if we don't use COVID-19 recovery as an opportunity to build out the infrastructure for a more sustainable clean energy future, this could really potentially set us back in a way. People are installing less renewable energy than they otherwise would during this period of recession. People are buying less electric vehicles. Governments, are focusing relatively more on the economic distress of the population for very good reasons than climate policy versus a world where COVID-19 hadn't happened. And so, we should make sure to emphasize that it's not clear yet that there's any silver lining at all to this situation, despite the fact that it's leading to a short-term emissions reduction. That said, there is this interesting question around what it means for peak CO2. And if you bring up my other slide, I'll try to cover this quite quickly because I'm a little short on time. But if you simply look at the trends over the last 10 years in global economic activity and the rate of decarbonization, and by decarbonization here, I mean essentially how much CO2 is emitted per dollar of economic activity globally, we would have been on track for global emissions to peak around 2024 in the absence of COVID-19. Now, obviously, there's huge uncertainties around that, right? Assuming that the past rate of economic activity over the last 10 years continues, a big assumption. Assuming that the rate of decarbonization over the last 10 years continues, is a big assumption. But if those held true, global emissions probably would have peaked around 2024. And so there's a real chance, and again, it's large uncertainties, so I don't want to make any sweeping claims here, but there's a real chance that it'll take long enough for the global economy to get back to where it was before COVID-19 that we might see 2019 as the peak in CO2 emissions. So what this figure shows is a very simple model, essentially using the last 10 years rate of decarbonization and GDP growth to forecast future emissions with some wide uncertainty ranges in gray in a sort of base case non-COVID-19 world. And then looking at both the 2020 and 2021 GDP predictions from the IMF in their sort of low impact case in blue, as well as the uncertainties. And obviously, the economy could grow faster in 2022 and 2023 than it otherwise would have because it's still recovering. That's not taken into account in this sort of analysis. But if indeed we were on track to peak emissions in the next 5 to 10 years, there's a real chance that this event will set economic growth back far enough that we may see that the peak occurred in 2019. And we just need to wait till we get more data and a few more years of emissions, and we'll find out for sure.
Okay, many thanks, Zeke. So we've heard from all the panelists, and thank you for those contributions. We've just to update on the Zoom headache we've been having. We're still having problems, but we do know that many people are now watching live on the YouTube live stream, which is fantastic, and obviously people can watch that afterwards as well. But we have been still been getting in a lot of questions sent in advance and also some in live. And what I might do now is I'm just going to pick out a few just to sort of spark the discussion and just to give a flavor of some of the sort of types of questions we've been sent in. We've been sent questions from kind of university professors through to sort of A-level geography students. For those outside the UK, A-level means about sort of 16 to 18-year-olds. So we've had a huge range, and also from all over the world. Maybe let's kick off with one of the questions we've had actually from those students. We've had a question on behalf of these students at the King's School in Worcester here in the UK. And they're asking, is there a significant lag time between emissions and the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? I mean, maybe is that one that, Richard, do you want to maybe step in and speak to that?
Yes, yeah, thank you. Well, once you've emitted CO2 that's already in the atmosphere, so there's no lag in terms of the emissions going into the buildup in the atmosphere. But the important, this is a really important question there, because the lag is more in how it dies away. If we were to cut off, if you release a huge burst of CO2 into the atmosphere just as a one-off, and then left it, it would still take centuries or even thousands of years to die away completely, because CO2 doesn't break down chemically in the atmosphere. It can only be removed by being taken up by ecosystems, so plants as they grow, or by being absorbed in the ocean waters, and also by rock weathering on much longer timescales as well. So it takes a long time for any impact of putting it in to actually come away again, and that's why this sort of this smaller reduction, this large reduction in emissions has not translated into an actual reduction in concentrations. It's why the CO2 is still building up in the atmosphere. So it's just building up, but slightly slower than it was before.
Okay, we've got another interesting question, maybe one for Zeke, but feel free, any other panelists, to step in after this as well. And someone has emailed in, it's actually Sharon in the Yukon Territory in Canada, and has asked a question around, which I think is a fascinating question really, which is around the impact on aerosol emissions. So if there's been lots of reduced traffic, let's say, in China, the US, Europe, all around, what is that likely to, what impact is that likely to have in terms of, not sort of global emissions in terms of carbon emissions, but what could that be masking some warming temporarily? I don't know. Zeke, is that one you want to pick up first in terms of what impact the reduction, presumably quite great reduction in aerosol emissions has been?
Sure, I'll touch on it a little bit. I'm sure others might have some thoughts as well. So aerosols in the atmosphere have a strong cooling effect in two different ways. One is they're very reflective particles, particularly sulfate aerosols. So they reflect some of the incoming sunlight back out to space. So the Earth's surface gets dimmer, there's less solar radiation reaching it, which cools the surface a bit. And the second is that they serve as what are called cloud condensation nuclei. So essentially, you need little specks of dust or aerosols or other things in order for clouds to form more easily in the atmosphere. So if you have a lot of aerosols in the atmosphere, you end up getting a bit more clouds, and particularly sort of very reflective clouds that can also reflect solar radiation back to space. So that's sort of the direct and indirect effects of aerosol are to cool the planet. And so there's a really interesting question as we have this sort of unprecedented experiment in cutting back economic activity. Not only what effects is it going to have on CO2, but what effects is it going to have on these cooling aerosols. And so far, there haven't been, to my knowledge, any conclusive studies on this yet. There's a lot of different researchers around the world working on the question. Certainly, we haven't seen very strong evidence of regional patterns in global temperatures in March and April. That we might expect if there are very strong regional reductions in aerosols. But again, it's something that will require a lot more research to tease out exactly how the reduction in output from coal plants, the shutting down of factories, various other reductions in industrial activity and transportation have affected aerosol emissions and the climate through that.
Okay, I can see a hand up from Richard. Do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, thanks, Leo. So Zeke's explained that really nicely, and I agree with what he said. I just wanted to point out that to avoid any misunderstanding, in the UK, we've been very lucky to have fine, dry, sunny weather for the last couple of months. This is nothing to do with the change in aerosol emissions. We've had beautiful blue skies and so on, but it's just been high pressure systems. The jet stream has been away from the UK. We've been just lucky with the weather. This is not an impact of the aerosol reductions that Zeke just correctly described, just to clear that up.
Okay, Lauri, I can see your hand.
Yep, so we've been tracking the impact on air quality and air pollutant emissions very closely because that's what we focus on. And one thing is that the biggest drop has been in transport, especially in inner city transport. So we're seeing almost across the world, we're seeing very dramatic reductions in nitrogen dioxide emissions, which then form nitrate aerosols as well. Those are the famous NASA maps that have, or European Space Agency maps that have been making the rounds. There has been much less impact on especially the kinds of particles that you get from household fuel burning. So India, Southeast Asia, many other developing places, that's a major source of particle emissions. And the other one is industries where the impact varies a lot by country. But even for the power sector, where we've seen these 10, 20, 30% reductions in coal burning, depending on the country, that's not as dramatic as some of the past shifts, like when Chinese coal plants installed sulfur scrubbers. That was a much more dramatic change in global emissions than what has taken place now. So I think it's also, this crisis is also highlighting how many different sources are responsible for these emissions, and in a lot of places it's actually been a question that we get a lot. Why aren't we seeing more of an improvement in air quality while no one's driving their car? So people generally overestimate the role of local transport in all of this.
Okay, we've had a question, which I think probably Corinne is probably best placed to answer, given the paper, the Nature Climate Change paper out this week, which is coming from Mohammed El Said in Egypt, who's a science writer who works for the Daily News newspaper. And Mohammed is asking, are there any certain impacts from the COVID-19 lockdowns on the emissions in the Arab region, sort of North Africa, Middle East? I mean, I know your analysis went and looked around the world. We've heard a lot about China, India, the US, Europe. Is there anything that you can drill down and explain around some of the other regions around the world, for example, the sort of the Middle Eastern area?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Mohammed. We did try to look as many countries as possible. And in our analysis, what we found is that the change in emission was directly proportional to the stringency, I guess, of the lockdown. So we looked at if only light measures were in place, then you had just a little change, maybe 10% in a country's emission, maybe even 5%. When you started to have lockdown that affected half the population, maybe some restaurants were closed, some university students encouraged to work from home, some school closed, then you had a much bigger change in a country, perhaps up to 20% drop in emission. And when you had a full lockdown, then you went down to 30, 35% at the country level. And so, you know, you'll have to tell me how the Arab regions really changed their lockdown, but there were quite a few regions, at least in the Middle East, that were on the full lockdown, and there they had very big drop in emissions, and same thing in North Africa. It could be, of course, that countries will be locked down in the future as the pandemic is moving around the world, but that's the evidence that we have so far. Thanks for your question.
Okay, and we have a question from Germany, from Suzanne Skodel, I hope I pronounced that right, who works for Arcor, this is a really interesting question. So she's asking, what are the views of the experts on the availability of accurate data regarding CO2 sources and sinks from local to global scale, and then the links to CO2 budgets and inventories? Does anyone want to take on that question around the data? I can see Lauri raising his hand. So over to Lauri first.
Yeah, I had to jump in because it's a pet peeve of mine that if we think CO2 is a problem, I can't believe that most of the information that we're still getting is, you know, in June, we'll get the annual data for 2019. So with a 6 to 18 months lag, and I think Corinne's work and mine and so on has been trying to bridge that gap. And it also doesn't work in the way that more developed countries are better at this. There are, for example, in India and China, we can track power sector emissions on the daily level, and that's not true of many developed countries. So we have some data from the emissions trading system, from grid operators like we do in Europe on an hourly and daily basis. But for example, oil consumption in Europe seems to be incredibly hard to track. There's very little information on how much gasoline or diesel is being sold, and so on. So it's not easy to get data on those things. And yeah, if we're serious about measuring how well we're doing on climate change, I think it's important for that data to be available on a much more granular level. Just imagine if we were reporting on GDP and employment every year with a 6-month time lag.
Okay, thank you. I can see your hand raised, Corinne. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, as in all crises, I mean, this one is sparking innovation in the way we use data for energy and emissions analysis. I mean, conventionally, we use just energy, and that's reported at the country level, but we've realized, particularly for transport, what a myriad of data there exists there that we could be using. And I'm quite convinced that we'll be tapping on that new source of observations, indirect observations maybe, but still very rich. And like, for example, the Royal Society is working on a project called Digital and the Planet at the moment to try and make those streams of data much more available and much more useful. And that could, I think this is really the way to go. And just to thank the tech company who've made their data available there. But I completely agree with Lauri that for something as important as emissions, we should have a much better granular grasps at the country and even at the urban or individual level. And I think we can get there with a little bit more use of modern data.
Okay, thank you, Corinne. Simon, I think you've got a question you want to raise.
Yeah, I think just one that maybe addresses, since we've been covering this question about how emissions have been affected by the current crisis, one of the most common questions that we've had, and I think this has come up a lot, is just a sort of gap in people's understanding about if this is, this is such a huge effect that it's having on people's lives around the world. Why aren't emissions falling further? And if the peak in global emissions reduction was 17% only, what's responsible for the rest of those emissions? Obviously, part of this is just down to gaps in timing. So China locked down sooner and then started easing restrictions. But it isn't only that; it's also down to the types of sectors that are being affected. And I think maybe Corinne could speak to this to start with, but others obviously feel free to intervene.
Yeah, thanks for your question. Yeah, I mean, I've also been wondering just why isn't it more? I mean, it's 31% in the UK, and what's driving the other 70%? And, transport, for example, is cut in half. So the other half is from people having to go to work, maybe health workers, people who take care of food and so on. But more importantly is the use of power and industry. The emissions there haven't actually dropped that much, 15% in power as far as we can tell. Of course, it's uncertain, and industry may be between 30 and 40%. So there's really latent heat use there, which I have to say I was surprised it was so big. So is it automated machinery? Is it like coolers and heaters? Is it inertia in the system because we can't put the industrial plants on and off so easily? Or is it that we're wasting a lot more energy than we thought? And I think we have a big challenge here in the research community to just really dig into this. Why is it we were still for so long and still we use so much energy? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm just looking at, we've been receiving a lot of questions via the YouTube live stream. So I'm just going through those now. I'm just having a quick look, and many thanks for everyone's understanding of moving over to the YouTube live stream due to the technical problems we've been having with the Zoom attendees. But I'm just having a quick look through them now. There is a question here from Tim Baxter via YouTube, who's asking, what are the characteristics of countries where emission cuts under COVID-19 are relatively shallow and where they are relatively deep? I don't know if Corinne wants to come in on that question around this. We've touched a little bit on the differences around different regions, but on the different characteristics between some of those different sort of patterns, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, the sector that was most affected is transport, mostly road transport, but aviation literally collapsed. So the countries that had more of their emissions due to transport were the countries where their emissions cut the most, and the countries where the emissions were mostly in power sector, then they were cut the less. And in addition to this is the level of lockdown actually had a huge influence. And New Zealand, for example, has a lot of its emission from aviation, and that's why it was one of the countries that had the highest drop in emission.
Okay, I can see Lauri's hand.
Yeah, I think it's worth making two additional points. So China's as emission structure is obviously very different. Households play a very small role. Industry plays an absolutely outsized role, and the reason why there was still such a dramatic impact in China is that construction sites were stopped. A lot of industries were stopped either by the containment measures themselves, or often because the lockdown started right before the Chinese New Year holiday, with everyone who could traveling back home and not being at their place of work. So it took a long time for people just to get back to where they work. The other aspect is for the power sector. The impact has been the most limited in those countries where the power mix is almost entirely coal or fossil fuels. So countries like Indonesia or South Africa, whereas in countries that have a more diverse mix, the impact on coal has been amplified a lot. So, for example, in Europe, a 10% reduction in power demand might translate to a 30% reduction in coal consumption, because coal is the fuel that is in the margin. And in that sense, this has really been a dry run of what the power system of the future will look like. Much less coal, much higher share of renewables.
Okay, I can see Richard's hand as well.
Yeah, so thanks. There's an important point here, and also this relates to previous discussion points as well. We've talked exclusively about energy emissions so far, but also we know much less about what's happening with land use change emissions. I mean, that is a smaller part of the global total. I think it's about 10 billion tons of carbon emitted by energy, and about 1 to 2 from land use, roughly. I think we just don't even have the data as to what's happening with land use change and deforestation and so on at the moment. So that is a big question mark about the role of individual countries right now. And also that helps with the sort of answer the question as to why there's still emissions happening, even though there's been this large cut in the energy sector. We just don't know what's happening with land use.
And Zeke?
Sure, very quickly, it's important to differentiate between sort of relative and absolute reductions in emissions. The countries that are going to see the largest reductions in emissions in 2020 are likely countries like the US, the UK, EU countries that have already been on a pathway of reducing emissions for the last decade. Countries that have historically had very rapid economic growth and more rapid increases in emissions are probably going to see, more modest reductions, if not small increases in emissions this year, even if the reduction relative to what otherwise would have happened in the world without COVID is quite large. And so it's important to recognize that sort of the underlying long-term rates of economic growth and emissions have an effect on the overall reductions that will happen.
We haven't got too long left. We've got about 8 minutes or so left, and it's fair to say a lot of the questions we've been receiving are quite policy focused. So we've been discussing about the emissions impact, but a lot of people are understandably asking about what this all means for the implications for climate and energy policy and transport policies, etc. In the sort of months and years ahead. We've had a question via YouTube from Soren Thompson, who's asking around, we often talk about trying to decouple GDP growth from CO2 emissions. And Soren is asking around, will this crisis and will this pandemic and the lockdowns, will it help to decouple GDP growth from CO2 emissions? Or could there be a sort of an argument for saying it could lock us back into some of the old habits, perhaps? I don't know. It looks like Lauri wants to go first for
that. Yeah, so I think it's good to think back to the global financial crisis, where there was a very polarized effect. Developed countries generally had much faster reductions in emissions after the global financial crisis, and had major shifts away from coal in the power sector in particular. 2 countries, China and South Korea, went for a massive stimulus approach, stimulating the most energy intensive parts of the economy. That then meant that their they actually went backwards in terms of the carbon intensity of their economies. And this is what I highlighted about China right now, that those decisions that determine whether this crisis will move China to a more modern economic structure with less of a role for these smokestack industries and government-driven construction, or whether it will turn back the clock again, is the big question that is being settled right now, and indeed tomorrow will be very important in that sense.
Okay, Corinne?
Yeah, thank you. This crisis, the COVID crisis, shows us really clearly how vulnerable we are and how we don't take risks seriously. We don't prepare for risks. So governments that want to rebuild the economy need to take this into account and rebuild in a way that is more resilient to both sanitary and climate risks. And this can only be done by looking hard at the economic stimulus packages and all the actions that go around there and drive the change that we need to move from this very carbon intense economy to a low carbon economy. And this means financing this infrastructure that we need, but it also means supporting change, like how we're going to go back to work is not individual choices. This is a matter of government making it safe for people to cycle and walk to work. It is about governments thinking about what happens to the car industry. If they bail out the car industry, you could put conditions on it for having a plan for change. All the mobility should be electric as quickly as possible, and action there from announcing what you're going to do, to building charging points, to supporting workers, for training, for putting a tax on carbon, and name it. So governments need to drive the overall change and not just say, we'll throw a little bit of money here, throw a little bit of money there, and then builds very brown stuff on the other side that will compensate all the good things that happen. So I expect and hope, a lot of governments have mentioned that they realize we need to build differently, and I expect and hope that this change will be driven from central government across ministries and to take us down home, which is net zero carbon emissions, as quickly as possible.
Zeke, we have 3 minutes left. I might be able to squeeze another question, but do you want to quickly respond to that?
Sure. So I just want to echo the other two panelists that, you know, what really happens going forward to decarbonization is up to us and up to the response of our governments to this crisis. The one interesting dynamic, at least here in the United States, is that, you know, a lot of our policy process is characterized by gridlock and moving very slowly. And crises like this are a rare occasion when it is possible to spend a lot of government money very quickly on big programs. And so if we choose to respond with stimulus and recovery measures that emphasize, you know, the types of infrastructure we need to decarbonize our economy, like modernizing transmission, like renewable energy and other clean firm generation, it could really, you know, put us on a very different track than we were a few years back. But, you know, this remains to be seen how big a priority that will be in recovery efforts.
So I'm very aware of time, and I appreciate everyone, you know, all the panelists' time to make themselves available. I think, given some of the technical problems we had and some of the superb questions we're still receiving, what I might suggest is that I might share some of those questions with the panelists afterwards and see if they've got time perhaps to respond to them, or maybe even post some of them on Twitter in a minute. For example, I can just see there's a good question we just had from the New York Times. There's one from Reuters as well. And I think it's very valuable that some of these questions should be addressed. And unfortunately, we are limited by this single hour. But just before we wrap things up, and I just want to say that once I've sorted out the Zoom problems, we will, I think, try and put on another webinar, maybe in a couple of weeks, which will focus quite tightly on the policy implications. It's quite clear from some of the reader questions that people really want to dive in and discuss that, as well as some of the issues we've been talking today about the the scientific analysis looking at the impact on emissions. So I think our time is up, sadly, but I'm going to just say huge thanks to the panelists for their insight and their time, and also just to say thank you very much to my colleagues at Carbon Brief, not least Simon for helping to moderate this event, but also my colleagues who behind the scenes have been trying to sort of corral and gather together all of these reader questions and feed them to me. So we've got Rob McSweeney, Daisy Dunn and Josh Gabatis who've been doing that, and also dealing with the firefight that is the YouTube live stream at the moment. We've got Tom Harrison and Tom Prater. But I just want to say many thanks again, and let's do this again at some time. So thank you very much to all the panelists, and see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions.
Yeah, great questions. Thank you.